Good morning. My name is John Beckham. I'm the Managing Director and CEO of the North American Development Bank. Thanks to all our viewers and listeners for joining us today. It's my pleasure to have as our guest Donovan Burton. He's the Senior Vice President for Water Resource Management and Government Affairs or Government Relations at the San Antonio Water Authority. And for those of you who don't know, the San Antonio Water Authority is in charge of distributing potable water and providing sewer services to the city of Antonio, one of the fastest growing cities in Texas and the United States. For those of you who are tuning in from Mexico or prefer to hear this in Spanish, we have simultaneous translation, and we'll have some instructions here briefly for you. You can use the More option to go and select your channel, whether you want to hear it in Spanish, and you'll have simultaneous translation at that time. Thank you. So Donovan, welcome to the North American Development Bank.
Thank you.
Really happy to have you here.
Excited to be here. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Super. Well, one of the reasons, as we were discussing before we started the webinar, within the border region, we have a significant challenge to manage the water risk inherent in the border region, both on the Mexican side and the U.S. side. And a lot of our communities are dependent on a sole source of water. And a lot of those sources of water are increasingly stressed or don't have the same reliability as they historically have. So one of the reasons we're really grateful to have you here is that the city of San Antonio offers a lot of experience and know-how on how it's managed this challenge for this important and large city. And we're really hopeful that you'll be able to share some ideas, milestones, thoughts about what we as the bank can do, as well as our border communities should think about as they work through their investment and planning horizons to ensure water availability for their communities.
Right.
So with that said, how has SAWS diversified its water sources to ensure that San Antonio and its residents have the water they need?
Yeah, well, certainly, and you mentioned some of the areas on the border. It extends all over the world. A lot of water utilities face the same issues that are out there. So we all share in some of the same challenges. Certainly water diversification is a big piece of that. As we grow, the growth of the economy, growth of population means we all need more water supplies to go forward. A big piece of that is conservation, but a big piece of that as well is making sure that we have enough water supplies and a diverse water supply. So specifically, you mentioned some of the diversification efforts. We go back 30, 40 years with San Antonio, and we were essentially what I say is a one-horse town. We had one water supply as well. It was the Edwards Aquifer. That particular aquifer is shared by a number of different entities, from agriculture to springs to downstream communities, and ultimately into the coastal region. So a lot of people are invested in making sure that that shared aquifer is preserved for the future. So we have a lot of discussions about what that meant. It is also shared by an endangered species. And so about 30 years ago, we had a judge came in and said, we need to change the regulations of the Edwards Aquifer, which meant that we were essentially cut off. Whatever you're using today, you cannot grow on the Edwards Aquifer. You've got to stop. And so that sent us off into a thought process of diversifying our water supplies. And so up to now, again, we had one supply. We focused heavily on conservation, on reuse as our first sort of steps in that. But we've also developed another 12 different supplies. We have 13 different water projects from 7 different water sources now. So it's been really a model throughout the nation that San Antonio has had. And San Antonio obviously is the city of San Antonio, but we also go out to the county line and slightly beyond that. So we're over 2 million people, just that of the people that we serve in terms of water and sewer service.
So I understand then that really is water diversification. You can break it out into 3 different components or pillars. One was conservation.
Yeah.
Another part was diversification, and then third was or is new sources. And is that the relative order of emphasis you all place on, or would recommend some of these communities to place on it? Or
yeah, I think the very first one is conservation. That would be the number one first line of area where we would look to preserve our future water supplies. We get an enormous benefit out of conservation. We can talk about that in a little while. But then it's about alternative and reuse supplies. That's where we got into the recycle water side of it to offset some of our use, hand in hand with conservation, but slightly different. And then third would be developing alternative and new diverse water supplies. That would be the order I would say.
Okay. And you said you started this process when you had a county judge 30 years ago. So how do what over that 30 years, what advice can you give us in terms of getting started, and what are the realistic horizons?
It will certainly take time. Certainly developing water in anywhere takes at least a decade, sometimes 2 decades or more. We have a lot of communities, Dallas and other people who are developing reservoirs, brand new reservoirs. And to do that, they are in the 30 years of developing that. So developing new water supplies takes a long time, which is why I stress do what you can with what you have. That's the conservation and the reclamation side of it. But yeah, we started, obviously we had already thought the process of developing a reclamation, a reclaimed water and recycled water system at that time.
Sure.
We knew that we would ultimately have to grow, but with the federal judge issuing an order in 1993, that really propelled our process into developing new water supplies.
So once again, necessity was the mother of invention in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you need a good swift kick in the pants to push you on to that next phase.
Whether it's Mother Nature or a judge.
Yeah.
Interesting. I take it that you all you had a swift kick in the pants, as you just said. What other partnerships, though, were required to pull this all together? Or did you guys, bootstrap it by yourselves?
You cannot do any water supplies by yourself. You absolutely need community buy-in, legislator buy-in, regulatory buy-in, regional buy-in. All of the water supplies, it's not just a product that you invent whole cloth. You have to go somewhere and get it. Particularly now, all of the water supplies that are under our feet are spoken for. So we're going to have to go out into the regional areas to develop new water supplies. And so anything you do has to have a regional, sometimes international buy-in in terms of developing that supply. Again, what we do impacts all the way down to the coast. The coastal economies know sometimes more that what we are doing in San Antonio than we do in San Antonio. You kind of take it for granted. So at the time, certainly in the 90s, we had a lot of business community. We had a lot of elected leadership. We had, who's now our CEO, Robert Puente, was in the state legislature at the time. So we had a lot of partners in this that worked with us to make sure that it was successful. I will say it wasn't always successful. Even though we went off on the process of planning, we didn't always get the supplies that we had planned for. And so implementation is the bigger key than just planning. And that's going to take partnerships. It takes money, it takes legislators, it takes a number of different things.
And how did, in those partnerships, were there any, there's always different viewpoints, to not say competing interests. How do you manage that creative tension, if you will, to get to a solution that's workable?
Absolutely critical for developing new water supplies. Again, as I said, we were going out into the region and out elsewhere. And so that means that everyone has to be in the same room talking about it, and doing a little dance and looking for ways that I can create a win-win scenario so that it's not a win-lose type of a scenario. I have to work with all of the various regional bodies to make sure that we're all working lockstep.
So you've been clear that you need to do conservancy, and I think that's, as I understand it, that's obviously as simple. It can be described as simply as just turning off the faucet while you're brushing your teeth. But what other? Sometimes it's hard to imagine that actually scaling up. So how do you create that consciousness and measure what is the success of those conservation efforts?
Yeah, conservation is absolutely key, and so it started off with simple messages of turning off the water when you're brushing your teeth, that sort of thing, changing out toilets, that saved a lot of water over the time. All of that is pretty much done. A lot of the indoor water use, at least from a fixture standpoint, is kind of done. Now it's about giving individuals the tool to regulate their own water use. People want to save money and they want to save water. And so things like putting in new meters, automated meters that give people real-time data, real-time information on how they are using their water. People don't know that a back toilet is running for hours on end, and it increases their bill. So putting tools in the hands of people like meters, knowing what sort of water use that they are using, it helps us in a force multiplier situation. From us, conservation is a huge benefit. We talk about some of the money savings with it. Again, recycled water is a big piece, but had we not, we've had almost a 50% reduction in personal use over the last 40 years. Had we not had that conservation, we would have needed about 5 more major projects, probably $15 to $20 billion in excess of what we would have need to ask our ratepayers, our customers, for more money to pay for new projects, causing more stress and that sort of thing. So the value of conservation is enormous, and it's incalculable. So
yeah, well, as a banker, those are eye-popping numbers. That we'll get to that, as if you will, in our conversation. You touched upon water reuse briefly. What does that mean to a consumer of any in the San Antonio region?
Yeah, so it's making sure that we are doing everything with everything we have, making sure that, and so specifically water reuse is largely, as we send the water to the wastewater treatment plants, it's cleaned up. We're able to actually capture some of that and bring it back. After we've treated it, we purified it, it is now back into a non-potable system and used for irrigation, used for the San Antonio River. So the Riverwalk, what a lot of people don't know, it is a river. There would be water in it. We're in a major drought right now. If there wasn't recycled water in the Riverwalk, it would be a concrete ditch with a tiny bit of water trickling through it. Right. So we are able to provide a recycled water system throughout. We actually have the largest direct recycle system in the nation. And so being able to ensure that the Riverwalk works in the way it should, providing water to like Toyota and those sorts of businesses. I was going to ask that. It's a big benefit. It costs a fraction of what potable supplies do. And you're also not subject to some of the drought restrictions that other people are with a potable supply. So recycled water is an enormous benefit throughout the entire city for an economic benefit.
So in the last few years, anyone who's lived in South Central Texas knows that this region has been growing gangbusters. Yeah. And I think even I know you spent a lot of time in Austin as a Longhorn student, and his work, but we might even be, San Antonio might be growing faster than Austin is what I'm getting at. So what is the SAWS perspective for planning what is increasingly a desirable place for people to live and work? And this is not just unique to San Antonio. All respect to our neighbors in Austin, they're growing as well. Our neighbors in South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley are growing as well. There's a lot of talk about nearshoring. So how do you all think about the future demands that kind of population and economic activity could generate for you?
It is a major piece of what I specifically do in planning for new water supplies. And again, it's not only San Antonio. San Antonio is
Right.
not only San Antonio, it is an entire region. And this region has 5 to 6 million people and growing. This is the fastest region in the nation. And so all the way up to Austin, between San Antonio and Austin, all of those impact what we do in San Antonio. Developing new water supplies. We have the entire region going after some of the same water supplies. And so we have to make sure that we're all talking to each other, making sure that water is preserved for everyone. So making sure we plan for that growth is essential. It's also not only just population. You have a big effort from a statewide perspective and a nationwide perspective to bring in high water use customers like data centers and semiconductor plants and those sorts of things. One of those puts an enormous strain on the water supplies in a particular area. So it's about making sure that everybody is in the room in that entire region.
And when you say everybody in the room, is that sort of done informally, to not say ad hoc, or are there certain regional planning bodies in which you all participate or have created as part of this process?
Yeah, both are important. You need the ad hoc, you need the one-on-one. I need to go to lunch with people and walk through what their needs and fears and concerns are. And so you need the informal process, but we do have a lot of formal processes as well. We have a regional planning group that gets together again throughout the region all the way down to the coast, and we talk about it and we plan for it. We actually have a formal plan that goes through the Texas Water Development Board and all of that. So that's a formal regional and state water planning process. We also, as I mentioned, our Edwards Aquifer has a group called the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan. And that's a very specific group of people that get together and plan out the future of the Edwards Aquifer. And we actually submit something to the Fish and Wildlife Department. They issue a permit, and it's a whole body of work that we do. And so both formal and informal processes are important.
Shifting gears a bit before we get to the dollars and cents, Donovan, you mentioned we're in a prolonged period of drought.
Yeah.
And in your 18 years working at SAWS, how has changing weather patterns and rainfall affected your work and that of the Water Authority?
So we have lived, just in my last decade, we've lived through 2 of the worst droughts in our history. And so we generally think of the 1950s as the record drought. Well, right now, from 2018 to now, we've really tracked right along the same pattern as the 1950s drought record, the worst in our history. But the 2011 through 2015 drought was enormous as well. So we have to plan for that. We have to make sure that our water plans take into account those kinds of conditions. We don't plan to have water in wet times.
Right.
We plan for the driest of dry times. And so these types of events like this enormous drought that we're going through in San Antonio, test our assumptions. And so in our water planning assumptions, are they correct? And so we were going through a water planning process, and we stopped about 2022 to make sure that our assumptions were correct. And they were, but we've been able to adjust our plan over the last 2 years. We have a draft plan out now that's saying how it is we're going to meet our future plans during the worst of droughts. So we have absolutely seen some significant drought over the last 2 years. Some of our supplies, by the way, I'll just kind of go into some of our supplies are maybe not drought proof, but drought resistant. Our future supplies will be a lot from brackish groundwater desalination, very deep, almost not quite a mile deep, but 1,500 to 2,000 feet deep, where we have brackish groundwater. It's not really subject to drought as much, and so not nearly impacted the way an Edwards Aquifer would be as well. We also have a storage facility, the largest groundwater-based aquifer storage and recovery, where we take water in wet times and we store it in a different aquifer. to use during these drought times. And so it's a matter of planning for the drought, not just always developing a new big supply, but how can we make better use of the water supplies that are out there?
I'm fascinated by the multiplicity of options that you all have to think about. The one common denominator, though, is they all sound expensive, Donovan.
Yeah.
So tell us about, what kind of capital expenditure budget are you all working with, and how do you manage those priorities?
Yeah. Well, and we haven't even gotten into the sewer side. So, so we've got a 50-50, our business line,
Yeah.
what we do. So we have an enormous requirement of a budget. We've got about a $3.2, I think, billion capital plan, just new projects over the next 5 years. Our budget is about $1 billion, just a little over $1 billion a year for our entire budget. My specific budget, just to pay for the projects that are out there now, we're paying over $100-something million a year for each one of these projects. Not each, but some of them. Actually, one of our newest projects is about $100 million per year. So these are very expensive. You're right. You're right on the cue there. You are going to have to develop new water supplies. It's going to cost everybody a little bit of money, a lot of money. But you also can't ignore the sewer side that you absolutely need.
I was gonna,
and the maintenance of our infrastructure, just the aging pipes and that sort of thing. We have a major initiative going on with what we call non-revenue water, leaky pipes, essentially. Aging infrastructure, making sure that these pipes aren't leaking. There's an enormous amount of money that we're spending to find leaks, to fix leaks, to replace new pipes.
part of your conservation efforts.
It's part of our conservation efforts, and we put that into the planning as well. How much water do we think we're going to lose? And that water loss goes into our figures as well.
Sure. You mentioned one project that we talked about before we started the webinar, Donovan, is the Vista Ridge project.
Yeah.
Why don't you, there's quite a few interesting aspects to that, because it was a very ambitious new water source that had some, what I will describe as some innovative financial solutions to the challenge of finding the capital necessary to do that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that project was entailed?
Yeah. The Vista Ridge project, all of these things that we've talked about, the Vista Ridge project is right in the center of every one of these pieces of it. Vista Ridge is our most recent big project, and that project is really going to make sure that we have water out into the future. And this was an enormous accomplishment that we were able to do with the community. You talk about partnerships. Vista Ridge is the largest water public-private partnership in the nation, or at least was when we developed it. Some of the challenges with developing water, again, I mentioned you've got to make sure that you're talking to other people. Regulatory issues are very critical in terms of maintaining a long-term water supply. Vista Ridge was done on a private sector basis, where the private sector came to us. They were the ones that developed the project. They spent their own capital, their own private dollars to build it, and all of the things that are associated with that. If they were to run into an endangered species while they're building the project, that was totally done at the risk of the private sector. So while we signed up for it, we didn't necessarily have to commit to it until it was a real project. All we do is hold out our cup, and they fill that with a certain amount of water, and we pay for it. If they cannot deliver that water, we don't have to pay for that water. And so it's a very innovative project that it developed over 50,000 acre feet, about 15% of our water supply, of almost 20% of our potable water supply. And so that was done in conjunction with our partners, our private sector partners. It's about 140 miles north of here, north and east of San Antonio. So you have to go further and further to develop new water supplies. Right. It has been an amazing project. It has worked exactly how we had expected it to work. It is delivering the water that we want. But it's also done in conjunction with knowing that there is local management of the resource. We have to make sure that there's preservation of the aquifer resource in whatever area you're dealing with.
Right.
That is a key component of it. And so it will be a continual discussion with that local area to make sure that any impacts on that aquifer are not negatively impacting that particular area. So the project has worked. It has been an amazing thing for the community, having that large of a project secure our water future.
So Donovan, you said 15 to 20% comes from Vista Ridge.
Yeah.
Did I understand?
Yes.
So how much comes now for San Antonio? How much comes from Vista Ridge? What comes from the Edwards Aquifer? What comes from recycled? I mean, broadly, what's the portfolio of water sources you guys are managing?
Yeah. So our Vista Ridge, about 50,000 acre feet per year, again, 15 to 20, depending on our potable supplies. Edwards Aquifer is slightly over 50%. So Edwards Aquifer is still the cornerstone of our water supply. The recycled water system is probably 7 to 8%, a little under 10%. And all of the other sources make up the remaining balance. So all the other sources are smaller. But we have, again, Edwards is our primary. The Vista Ridge is the second largest source of water.
Does the San Antonio water system have a target composition of its water sources for the planning?
Yeah, so through our planning horizon, we're going to keep the Edwards at about 50% of our water supply. We will have growth. Obviously, we talked a second ago about population and new businesses, and so we will have and we will need new water supplies. A lot of those new supplies will come from desalination, our groundwater desalination. And so once we scale up on that, and we do have a groundwater project right now, a desalination project that's been going since 2017, reverse osmosis desalination. We will scale that up to almost 3 times the size it is today, and then develop another project that's the size of Vista Ridge. So most of our future supplies will come out of desalination, and they will ultimately be a bigger source than even Vista Ridge.
Wow. I do know about desal, Donovan, that they require some energy, but I think we'll have to come back for another day to talk about how you're working with CPS and ERCOT on your energy needs to do those desal plants.
There's definitely a water energy nexus. It is definitely a key. Yes.
Well, the good news is the sun shines a lot in South and South Central Texas, so we should be able to capture some of that to power these deals.
I think so, yeah.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Donovan, for taking time to share some of your insight and experience with us. And to our listeners, I hope you found some interesting ideas and thoughts here about water resource management, which is conservation, reuse, and diversification. And we look forward to having other webinars and sharing the insights and the way our communities need to start thinking about water in new and creative ways. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for dialing in.